There it is. Yeah. Meeting is being recorded.
All right, here we go. So, today we have here one of the best personalities within the men's rights movement, Professor Janice Fiamengo. Please allow me to give a little introduction so that the audience will get to know about you, people in India. So, Janice Fiamengo retired in 2019 from the University of Ottawa, where she was a professor of English for about 16 years. Her specialty areas were 19th century British and Canadian literature. Around 2012, she became interested in men's issues, which led to the publication of Sons of Feminism, Men Have Their Say in 2018. She is also the author of the blogs The Fiamengo File and the corresponding video lectures The Fiamengo File 1 and 2.0, along with Steve Brule, a series of videos about the travesty of academic feminism. She currently lives in New Westminster, BC, with her husband, poet, and songwriter David Solway. Did I get it right so far?
Everything's perfect except that we moved to Vancouver proper, but that doesn't matter.
I may have some old information that I found out.
That's
All
okay.
right, Professor Janice, welcome to my channel. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. It's an honor to, get to interact with you and learn about so many details, which I'm really looking forward to. So, Professor, please tell us about you a little bit, a sort of introduction on what was the defining moment for you that made you side with the men's rights movement.
Well, thank you very much for having me on your show. I'm looking forward to it as well. The defining moment, I don't think there was a single defining moment. It was more that over time, I just came to see that the feminist narrative that I'd been taught as a university student, in which women were the innocent victims of a systematic oppression by men, that it simply wasn't true. And I began to feel terrible about teaching it to a generation of young men when I became a professor. It really wasn't until that later point when I was in the classroom as the authority, looking out at a group of young people, ages 18, 19, 20, I really began to feel terrible for the young men, and I imagined what it must be like to sit in university classrooms, hearing all about the terrible things that their sex had allegedly done over the last 100 years and more, never hearing anything positive about what men had contributed to our culture, and hearing that their only role in modern society really was to step back and to allow their morally superior sisters to take charge of every aspect of society, even as they recognized that in the modern day, those very young women already had many, many advantages over them in everything from specific scholarships that were available to women only. Uh, Everything from that, preferential hiring in all sorts of the professions that they would go on to, hope to find positions in, to a general culture that celebrated women and promised young men that the future was female. That slogan, "the future is female," is still very prominent in North American society, despite its evident bigotry. So yeah, I began to feel that I couldn't possibly continue with that narrative, and I began to look into some of the facts behind what I'd been taught, and to realize that many of those facts were just feminist myths.
Makes sense. All right. So, as we were discussing earlier, United States used to have a lot many social guidance programs towards in 1940s and 50s, where they keep giving advice about the dating etiquette for both men and women, family life, etc. One among them was this is for the audience just to set a context for them what we will be talking about. So, one among those videos was the 1959 short film "The Trouble with Women," which discusses a man who's a supervisor expressing his discomfort in dealing with women at workforce. When he complains to his manager about women's absenteeism and attitude problem, the manager shames the supervisor that he needs to put aside his male ego. Janice, could you please tell us how similar or different the situation used to be in Canada during the same period?
That is such a fascinating little video, isn't it? You see that how very early on, even in the 1960s, when the what we call the second wave feminist movement was just beginning, men were already being shamed merely for raising common sense objections to the presence of women in various public spaces and workplaces. I would say that the situation in Canada was very similar to what was found in the United States. And, the exact same kind of social justice movements and the push in particular to claim that any doubts that men had about any of the social changes that women were pushing for, that those doubts sprang from their own limitations and inadequacy rather than from anything in the that would be involved in the changes themselves. And that's exactly what happened. Starting in the 1960s in both Canada and the United States, there was civil rights legislation to outlaw any kind of job discrimination. And I think most people of goodwill agreed with that kind of legislation, that there shouldn't be discrimination on the basis of any inborn characteristic, whether it be sex or ethnicity or disability, that people should be judged on their abilities as individuals. But that didn't last. That wasn't enough. Pretty soon in the early 1980s, there was legislation introduced in both the United States and Canada. And I'm more familiar with the Canadian, but it was certainly going on in the United States too. There was legislation introduced to increase the representation of certain uh, so-called marginalized groups in the workforce, so that the legislation against discrimination actually turned into legislation in favor of discrimination. And that was discrimination that would promote women, that would promote ethnic minorities, and that would promote Indigenous peoples and eventually people with disabilities. Those were the categories of people who were to be preferred in job postings, began in job postings in the federal government and spread to many other corporations, large and small companies. And that legislation still exists and is still in practice 40 years later, even though it was promised at the time that it would be for only a short time. It was allegedly to address injustices in the past, although those past injustices were never proved. And it was never really made clear why disadvantaging some people in the present for crimes that they had never themselves committed, certainly for injustices that they had never benefited from. It was never argued why that was better than the discrimination in the past that was supposedly so terrible. So yes, it was always part of a revolutionary social movement to dramatically and quickly transform public life in North America in a way that nobody could object to without seeming to be against progress and to be prejudiced, even though what they were objecting to was prejudice. Then after that, that was in the 1980s. After that, all sorts of sexual harassment legislation was introduced into the workplace. And that made things even worse for men. They had to not only know that they were the white men in particular, but generally men. It was usually women who were benefited by this legislation. These men had to know then that not only were they the non-preferred members of the workforce, but they had to also know that anything that they did wrong, anything that a woman perceived as harassment, which was defined very broadly, it could include an unwanted compliment, it could include a request for a date, it could include even someone's gaze being too intense. So anything a man did that a woman didn't like, or even if she decided that she didn't like that man and therefore fabricated claims about what he had done, that his very job status, his ability to maintain his position, was dependent on her goodwill. And that again is still the case today in workplaces all across North America.
Right. So, what baffles me the most within the Indian context is that many feminists, as usual, and along with many MRAs, men's rights activists, they religiously believe that it was suffragettes who fought bravely a grassroots movement and won the right to vote. They
Yes.
never talk about how there was anti-suffrage movement. For example, in 1895, the women of Massachusetts, out of around 575,000 women voters, only 22,000 women gave an enthusiastic yes. That means almost 96% of women were never in favor of the right to vote at all, because it had to do with the conscription as well with respect to the military. That is one thing. And there were also instances where authors like Wilma Makel, if I'm right, towards a sane feminism, where she said
Mhm.
much of the pre war feminist agitation had been inspired by little more than lust for public celebrity and pointless rage. So, what was the reality of the first wave feminists?
Well, you've just outlined some of the things. Feminism was never, or rather, suffrage was never a particularly popular cause amongst women. And many women were not particularly interested in acquiring the vote and didn't think it was necessarily a good idea for other women to have the vote. It was generally recognized that women were not that. Um, Preoccupied with national and international affairs. The other point about the federal right to vote was that women had for many years the right to vote in municipal elections, in local elections. It was always recognized that women should have a say in local affairs. They were often allowed to vote in school board elections, for example, matters that directly related to their families, their children. So it was never the case that women had no say in public affairs. It was long recognized that women had a role in charitable organizations, that women were important to their society as educators, that they did have a political voice, and especially when they were nonpartisan, that they could lobby their male relatives and friends and members of their society in the political constituency, and that their voices had weight precisely because they were understood to have, a deep understanding of aspects of their society that complemented the understanding that men had. So women were never disempowered, and many women recognized that. So the suffrage movement was often seen as purely a divisive and self-promoting kind of movement that many women were not particularly interested in. And many of the tactics that suffragettes used in order to promote their cause, which included vandalism, um, even more terrible things such as setting off bombs in letterboxes and setting fire to country homes and breaking shop windows and attempting to assassinate politicians. I mean, there was a very violent terrorist movement, particularly in the United Kingdom, in the years leading up to the First World War, that horrified the public and seemed to prove that women were far too emotional, even hysterical, to be able to claim the right to political engagement. So there were all sorts of reasons why um, the public was not, both men and women, were not particularly in favor of the suffrage movement. And yet, following the First World War in Anglophone countries all across the world, women were enfranchised. So it's a very interesting piece of Western history.
So, in one of your older videos, I think, while talking about political correctness in Canadian academia, you said Canadian universities are not in the business of debating ideas anymore. They are in the business of declaring and enforcing what is and is not acceptable to say. So, while talking about it, I saw you reference Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind a lot. Can you tell us what influence the book have had on you, and why would you recommend this to an average reader?
Oh, well, Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind is a fascinating book about the um, the manner in which social justice ideas contaminated the academy beginning in the 1960s. And he talks about the ideal of disinterested knowledge that at its best academia was about, that he said that Socrates had declared that it was far more important to truly investigate what justice means, than to try to implement whatever particular form of justice happened to be roiling the politics and the political climate of one's own social moment. And I think that's what happened with feminism and various other ideological movements that started to take over academia in the 1960s and then really took hold in the 1970s, that they were never about the pursuit of truth itself. They were never about simply exploring ideas from an objective standpoint and to try to get as many different ideas as possible, but they were about implementing a particular vision of social justice. They were really about advocacy and changing students' minds and sending out students as foot soldiers into the
Yes.
wider society in order to implement a particular idea. And so I thought Bloom articulated that really powerfully in that book, although he was not particularly talking about feminism. He did talk about how he found it fascinating that even in the earliest days of the rise of social justice movements, that he found that his students were became less and less interested in debating ideas from all points of view and more interested in simply knowing what the correct attitude to take was. And you know, and this worried him because it signaled a decline in the appetite and the intellectual curiosity necessary to become a truly well-informed person.
Right. Makes sense because what happens in academia never stays in academia.
It does. That's exactly it. No, of course not. It goes out. Those students are sent out into the fields of law and medicine and social work and journalism and big tech and advertising and entertainment everywhere. And therefore, if they have been thoroughly indoctrinated, then the effect is massive.
Right. Right. So I also wanted to understand what are your thoughts on women hijacking religion? I'm asking this from the perspective that most of the religions I see, including the Hindu belief systems, there's always this nature of women trying to twist the existing teachings from the past into a feminist perspective and somehow use it as a convenient tool to create symbols of revenge out of the
Mhm.
existing deities and their teachings, and further use it to justify misandry towards men and boys because of the
Mhm.
non existent patriarchal oppression in the past, according to them. For
Mhm.
example,
Yes, well,
uh, yeah, please go ahead, please
go
go ahead.
ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, I'm interested to hear your example too. I just agree that because feminism and really all social justice ideologies, but our interest is feminism particularly, it is based on a grievance mentality. It isn't actually at all interested in understanding men and women's roles throughout history or how men and women cooperated to form their societies or anything like that. It's about a false idea that there is a class of oppressed people, in this case women, and that there's a class of oppressors who take pleasure in subordinating that other class, and that therefore it is right to hate. It is right on the part of women. Robin Morgan, one of the major architects of the second wave of feminism, said that it is right for an oppressed person to hate their oppressor. And there can be nothing more socially divisive than the conviction that one is oppressed and all of one's sisters are oppressed, and therefore it is right to harm men and to enact legislation to disempower them. The belief that somehow, because the last 2,000 or 5,000 years of human history have been the history of men oppressing women, that therefore it's okay for women now to take the upper hand and to disempower men and to see men suffer as a kind of class vengeance, that is what justice is. All of those ideas are deeply part of feminism and have been from the very first, and we can talk about that if you want to at all. It is there in the first documents of the feminist movement, certainly in Britain and in North America. And so it's terrible. It's not about a mutually enriching social contract in which men and women work together and recognize what each sex brings to society in a reciprocal manner with love and respect. It isn't about that at all. And that's obviously what we need to have well-functioning societies. But feminists, and I think even women who might not necessarily call themselves feminist, are very susceptible to that kind of resentment and that belief that they have been wronged both in their personal lives and that their sex has been wronged, and that therefore any kind of disjunction or imbalance between the sexes now is justified by that past injustice.
Because here's the catch. What do you think is the feminism's bargain with Islam? I mean, with all due respect to the victims of rape, if they actually are the victims, the issues surrounding rape have been exaggerated to an extent that most women affectionately embrace and advocate for Sharia law punishment when it comes to demanding, punishment for the male perpetrators of rape. And we don't see Western women, or for the matter of fact, Indian women, taking the fight head on with the Taliban and the Islamic states as such. There's definitely, an imbalance there in the way they don't try to hijack Islam when it comes to,
Yes.
advocating punishment only for a certain gender.
Yes, that the question of Islam and the feminist attitude towards it is really interesting. And I think what it gets at is that certainly, at least from the beginning of the second wave of feminism, it not only took a very strong anti-male position, but it actually took a very strong anti, certainly in the West, an anti-Western impetus, so that it actually hates the origins of Western culture, which it sees as oppressive. And now I suspect that it is the same in India, that there is actually a kind of deep self-loathing and a revolutionary longing to completely overthrow the society that is seen as oppressive and to ally oneself with any other groups that also want to overthrow that society that is claimed to be oppressive. And I think that's why, certainly in the West, many feminists are actually quite sympathetic to Islam, or at least are quiet about its, the atrocities that it perpetrates and its attacks on Western society. I think precisely because they admire its revolutionary fervor and they want to see their society overthrown. There is, I mean, that gets into a whole psychology of revolutionary movements that is beyond my full comprehension, but it's one of the things that is very noticeable in feminism, that often it seems that feminists don't really care very much about the the actual victimization of some women. They are much more interesting in punishing some men very, very harshly. But they're also very interested, it seems, in almost a masochistic kind of way in allying themselves with forces that, if they are triumphant, would result in women themselves being disempowered quite radically. So there is I think, a profound contradiction at the heart of feminism's goals and methods.
Right. I say this because I'm usually very critical of Islam. That's because would you believe that one of my own classmates from college ended up in one of the terrorist camps right after we finished our graduation. I found out that he was getting trained in one of the ISI camps in probably the north part of India. That was when I understood the radicalization of Islam among the youth is very concerning, and that was one of the at least for me, the defining moments where I thought we should definitely talk about Islam and its impact on the youth
Mm,
because of its
yes.
um, extremely radical ideas and the way that it motivates young men to hate other men based on the religion alone. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Well, and some people I think would suggest also it's understandable why young men would be drawn to Islam, especially if they feel alienated from their own societies, which is one of the effects of feminism, of course. If you're told from the time that you're very young that your group is not as desired, not as valued as this other group, of course, that's going to make men feel resentful, quite justifiably so, and to be attracted to an ideology that promises them a very powerful role and a strong central role, which I think Islam does, and that has very a very clear morality, especially if what's one's own society is in the process of losing its morality. Also, I think, from the woman's perspective, there is certainly a history in human society of women being attracted to the stronger males. And in cases where an invading, conquering group comes in and destroys the men in a particular group, well, the women who survived were the women who were capable of switching their allegiance from their own men to the conquering men. And I think it's not entirely far-fetched to suggest that many women, even while at the same time as they are demanding of the men in their own society that they become more feminine and that they defer to women, at the same time, those women are attracted to the very strong men of Islam. And in fact, in some way, perhaps totally unconsciously, look forward to a future in which those men triumph over the weak men that they themselves are creating in their own societies. I don't think that's a conscious part of feminism, but I think it might well be a factor in the strange anti-Western impetus in it, and the way in which often feminist women do seem to prefer um, men who break all of the rules of society and actually seem to have contempt and a desire to punish the men that most closely try to conform to what they claim they want.
right. This actually brings me to encourage me to talk about the cognitive dissonance of the feminist mindsets, because if you see in the works of Ernest Belfort Bax's the
Yes.
1906 book Legal
Mm.
Subjection of Men, he emphasized how throughout the 19th century the obligations of the wife to her husband were consistently lightened under British and American law, while the obligations of the husband to the wife remained in place. This actually also connects with what a New York divorce lawyer James Sexton had said some while ago, probably a year ago or something like that, where he says that promises that a man make in a marriage are legally enforceable even after divorce. whereas promises that a woman make in a marriage are not legally enforceable even after divorce. So, what is this
Yes.
exaggeration of?
Even within the marriage, they're not
Yeah,
enforceable.
yeah,
Right? Yeah, I know it's yes, that's always struck me, that the man promises in marriage that he will uh, give all that he earns to his wife, and that he will make sure she is looked after in material terms. That's essentially the man's contract. Her contract, at least traditionally speaking, is that she will uh, love and comfort the man. She will be his helpmeet. She will make his home for him, and she will provide him with children. And then that she will sacrifice her sexual autonomy in order to be his faithful companion, so that he will know that his children are actually his children. And that is the interesting thing, that none of those things that the woman was traditionally expected to provide, yes, over time, none of those have been enforceable, even within the marriage contract. Up until the 1960s, it was true that if the woman was unfaithful to her husband, he could divorce her for that. That's no longer the case. Certainly, the idea that the woman was to be the helpmeet of her husband, that's not enforceable in any way, even within the marriage, and wasn't for a long time. The notion that she was to comfort him, um, sexually, emotionally, etc., that may once have been a part of the marriage contract. It certainly wasn't by at least the late 19th century. There were all sorts of conduct books that made it clear to men that sexuality was the domain of the woman, that she was the one to decide whether sex would take place, that the man was never to force himself. It's true that rape was not a crime within marriage for a long time. It is now, of course. But I often think of that, when there's a divorce today, and ever since the introduction of no fault divorce, the woman is still entitled to her husband's earnings. He still has to support her, especially if she did not have a profession when she was in the marriage. But he's not entitled to anything at all. He doesn't get, yeah, anything. He's not entitled to his own children. If she doesn't want him to be entitled to them, he's certainly not entitled to the pleasures of her body, if he ever was. So yeah, the remarkable asymmetry there is, well, it's very striking, and yet it isn't something that feminists who supposedly care about equality have ever commented on.
yes. Since the topic of children has come up, I think we've arrived at one of the important topics in our discussion. In one of your older video discussion videos, talking about how Marx and Engels' work influenced feminism, you've summarized a solution formulated by the authors such as Mona Caird, Caird, if I'm getting the word right.
Yes.
So one of those
Hmm.
points is how mothers should be given default custody after divorce.
Yes.
So the
Hmm.
question is, whenever there are instances of mothers killing children, we are expected to empathize with mothers because
Yeah.
of postpartum psychosis. If
Yes.
mothers cannot be expected not to kill the children due to the postpartum psychosis, then women shouldn't be allowed near the children in the first place, let alone default custody after divorce, isn't it? What do you have to say
Yes.
about that?
I agree. I mean, it is quite striking. You mentioned that in preparation for this video, that there seems to be, not only is there that emphasis that women should be empowered to divorce, to be supported in their divorce, and to have custody of their children in divorce. That was something that the feminists in the 19th century took from Marx and Engels, particularly from Engels in his reformulation of Marx's papers in his 1884 book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the
Yes, yes.
State. And that's where he developed this idea of sex slavery, that marriage was nothing more than that. It was a kind of prostitution, and feminists really picked up on that language, and they still talk about sex slavery in marriage and in other forms of relationship between men and women. So yes, there was not only that, and at the same time, as you know, that leniency towards women who kill their children. And that aspect of the leniency toward women who kill their children, that permeates feminism. It's still evident today. Whenever there is a case of a man who kills his children, he's presented as a monster. He's presented as animated by the most brute power and cruelty and callous indifference, whereas the woman is always presented with excuses. She's the real victim, along with her children. And often people will come forward and say what a wonderful, loving mother she was. And, we're to sympathize as much with her as we are with the children that she killed. And that has a record that goes right back into the 18th century and the 19th century. Women always killed their children in quite large numbers. There's one professor, in fact, a Belfast professor named Pauline Pryor, who has estimated that up to 60% of homicides in the first half of the 19th century in the United Kingdom were of children under 1 year old, almost all of them killed by their mothers. And so that was simply a fact of life, that infanticide was par excellence, the crime of women, and that they were not punished for it often. They claimed postpartum depression, they claimed domestic violence or abuse or helplessness or desperation, various things. And juries, on the rare occasions when these women were actually arrested, charged, and tried for the murder of their children, juries were very reluctant to convict them. And so yes, I think your conclusion. Why then do we have the presumption that the mother is the best person to care for children, when at the same time we don't punish women who abuse and kill their children? It doesn't make any sense. And I think that our society would be set back on a somewhat firmer foundation if we at least had the automatic presumption of shared parenting, if not father custody. And I've read very persuasive arguments for the importance of father custody, and that being the fallback position, unless there could be shown that the father had been abusive. But unfortunately, in the divorce courts today, the vast majority of judges are prejudiced in favor of the mother. And if she makes any allegation whatsoever, all she has to say is that she fears her ex-husband will harm the children, and he's unlikely to be able to see them at all. She doesn't have to have any evidence that he has ever harmed them. And on the opposite side, even if he has evidence that she has harmed the children, it will be very difficult for him to have primary custody. So our whole system in the family courts is so terribly biased against fathers. And yet every study that's done shows that children who do not have contact with their fathers do worse in every way. Statistics of crime, the number of men who are incarcerated who either well, in most cases had no father at all present in their life, or occasionally had a bad father. But everything, adolescent criminality, dropping out of school, drug abuse, mental illness, all of the problems that young people have are hugely exacerbated by the lack of a father in their life. So it's a real crying shame, the way the family courts operate.
So also the audience might not know, but I want to tell it out loud that one of the topics that Janice and I frequently discuss is about the abortion and how abortion is men's issue as well. And this is for the audience who might not know that abortion is the leading cause of death in US even today. Women have killed more babies in the last 15 years 50 years than compared to the number of deaths that occurred in all the wars combined. So, what I want to ask you, Janice, is can you tell us how the relationships between men and women have been fractured ever since the introduction of the birth control pill? And how do you see that it has evolved from the 70s, 80s till the 2020, 25?
Hmm. Yeah. That's a very big question. I mean, I still think that the primary issue is that the hatred that women have been encouraged to feel towards men, that is the predominant reason that there's been such a fracturing. Now, about the birth control pill, I'm not an expert on that. It's very interesting to me that when the birth control pill was introduced in the 1960s, the idea was that it leveled the playing field, the sexual playing field between men and women. It meant that women could participate in sex in the same way that men did without the concern about an unwanted pregnancy. And, that this today, even, I think all feminists would pretty much agree that it is very important for women to be free of that reproductive burden. But what is so interesting to me about the issue is that rather than um, making things better between men and women, the introduction of free sexuality seems to have made things much worse. And it suggests that there are, at the very least, some differences between the way men and women understand sexuality. And it's interesting that um, feminists have continued to stress women's vulnerability in sexual relations, often even, by suggesting that the act of sex itself is somehow harmful to women. Yeah, there's a whole line of feminist theorizing that really starts with Simone de Beauvoir. I know you want to talk about her too, if possible. And it runs through other theorists like Andrea Dworkin, Susan Brown Miller, Catherine McKinnon, who see all heterosexual sexuality as akin to rape, really on a continuum with it. And so it's interesting that as women became more literally free through the birth control pill, they developed more and more divisive and acrimonious understandings of sexuality. And they tended to lump all of this, the misery of women, under the category of consent, claiming that, men needed to listen to women, whether, women said yes or no. Originally, the feminist slogan was yes means yes and no means no. And the idea was that men should not coerce women because this was a way, a very harmful thing to do to women. Only men allegedly coerce the other sex into sexuality. We now know that isn't true, but according to feminists, it's always men coercing women, and it became all about consent. And now we have even more, impossible and irrational laws about consent, where the woman is supposed to, certainly in Canada and Canadian law, in some states, um, the woman is to consent to every stage of sexual activity with an explicit affirmative. In other words, she is to say yes. The man is to ask, can I do this? She is to say yes. The actuality of sexual life is not like that at all. Most women do not want to be asked and to have to say yes at every stage. It is simply contrary to the way human beings are in sexuality. And yet that has become law, so that any man knows, even a married man, even a man in a long-term relationship knows that if his partner goes crazy and decides to claim that he didn't get consent for their sexual activity yesterday, that she could actually, at least in theory, have him convicted of sexual assault. So it's so interesting to me that that is the direction that feminism moved, in implying that everything between men and women in the realm of sex is about the dehumanization, the objectification, and the disempowerment of the woman. It certainly suggests to me that sexuality is a much, much more complex and emotionally nuanced thing than the feminists have ever recognized. Also, that this is something very, very personal that should be worked out between the individual man and the woman, and the state should not be involved with these draconian laws about consent. And also that, yes, that there are emotional components to it, that the idea of consent and of power do not even touch. And the problem with feminism is that, influenced as it was by Marxism and communism, it sees everything as a power struggle, and that is simply not relevant when it comes to the arena of emotions and love and sexuality.
Right. Apologies for the disturbance. Please don't
That's
mind.
okay.
Yeah. So since I think for almost 75% of this discussion, we've been very critical about it, I want to take things in slightly positive direction. So the reason to do this discussion is because it is observed that many men are still afraid to be critical towards feminism, including their own personal belief systems, which are gynocentric in nature, and they don't
Yes.
even realize that they live in this thick mist of anti-male propaganda, and many men
Yeah.
don't even know how to fight it, and they don't even realize that they are fogged up, that we're surrounded by this feminist fog, as Alan J.
Yeah.
Franzen calls it. So
Yes.
I,
Hmm.
I
Fem fog. Hmm.
yes, the fem fog. So this is also coming from a place of concern, because men have been demonized to such an extent right from the childhood, that
Yes.
they're left with no option except to hate themselves in the body that they're born, and they would
Yes.
go to an extent of cutting off their own penis. And
Hmm.
also this is also to mimic nothing more than womanhood, because they truly believe that if they transition to such a state, they will be accepted or they would feel good. So, what
Hmm.
I'm trying to get at is, are there any precautions that you would like to highlight so it may help men navigate in this anti male world without falling prey to the gynocentric trap?
That's the big thing, really. That's the thing that most, I think, prompted me to turn against feminism, was what I see it as doing to men and as having done to men. I think there is a whole generational process that's probably been going on for centuries, in which mothers have passed down to sons a certain kind of self-loathing and a longing for female approval, a sense of inadequacy in themselves as men, and a sense of uncertainty as to what it is that women actually want. And that, it first struck me when I considered the success of feminism. Obviously, if men were the dominant oppressors that feminists claim they are, they wouldn't have allowed any of the social changes that have occurred with so much rapidity, that disempowered men in so many ways. They wouldn't have allowed those to take place, and they did allow them. So that undermines the feminist claim. And I think men should recognize that too, that so much that men did was done out of love and done out of trust in women. Men had already built civilizations to protect their women and to make it possible for their families to be secure. For that, they were rewarded not with gratitude, but with denunciation, and with claims that much more needed to be done, and that in fact everything that had been done was done only for their own benefit and not for that of the women that they loved. Um, I mean, I guess I would say to men that they need to recognize all of those lies. And if there's one lie in feminism, it should give men heart to realize that there may be many. And if we go back, for instance, to the earliest document in the North American feminist movement by Elizabeth Cady Stanton called the Declaration of Sentiments from the First Women's Rights Conference in 1848, that is a tissue of lies. It's essentially a declaration of war against men. It's a declaration of independence, and it's modeled on the American Declaration of Independence. So it's women's declaration that they're going to be independent of men, and yet they're demanding that men do all sorts of things for them at the same time as they're saying that they are going to be independent. The thing that what was first struck when I read that document, in addition to the fact that it is a tissue of lies, it claims, for example, that men have closed all avenues of higher education to women. The document was written in 1848. There had been higher education institutions open to women since the late 18th century, essentially since the founding of the United States of America. Education of both men and women had been absolutely foundational to the vision of what America would be as a Protestant nation, where every person could read the Bible, and should be literate and able to make their own decisions about their, the good of their soul, and the good of their society, of course. The the first formerly male university to open its doors to women was Oberlin College, which still exists today. It opened its doors to women in 1837, and many other formerly male universities followed suit. So that by the time those many of them well-educated women gathered in Seneca Falls, New York, to have that women's conference, by the time that happened, they knew that the thing they were writing in the document, they must have known, was a lie. I mean, that boggles my mind. Those are demonstrable lies. That's just one of them, but there are many others. They claim that women, when they marry, lose all rights. This is in a society where women were active in agitating for married women's rights, and where there were all sorts of laws enacted, even in the state of New York, even in 1848, to protect any property that a woman brought into her marriage. That law was enacted in the spring of 1848. In the summer of 1848, they had the conference in which they claimed that women in marriage had no rights at all, including over their own property. So it's filled with lies. And yet, at the same time as it's filled with lies, men signed that document. 32 men who attended that conference signed it, and it's a denunciation of men. It says that the entire history of mankind is the history of men oppressing women. It's the history of, I can't remember the exact terms right now, the usurpation, and I forget the other term, having as its object the establishment of an absolute tyranny of man over woman. They say that that's the whole history of the relationship between men and women. And men signed that document. What kind of patriarchs were those? I mean, it is mind-boggling. And so that's what first made me realize those men already, supposedly these patriarchs, these dominant oppressive figures, they already believed that women were morally superior and that they owed women something, that they'd done women wrong. Even though they'd built the whole society, they died in wars, they were going to die in many, many more wars to come. Even though all of that was true, they were still ready to be convinced that they had wronged women. And yeah, I mean, so what does that say for men today? Since then, there has been decade after decade after decade of men trying to understand what women want and trying to give it to them, and women being no happier. Women today are less happy and more resentful than they've probably ever been, and they're still making all sorts of demands and claiming that much more needs to be done, and governments need to be even more involved in rectifying the injustices against women. So yeah, for men, I don't know. Yeah, it's I would certainly encourage men to find other men who validate them and recognize their value as men, and who resist the feminist dogma that somehow women are of more value, and that we should be more concerned about women. I mean, I don't have that, I don't think. I was initially influenced by feminism, and I believed that women had been oppressed, and I found that kind of exciting. It gives women a cause, and then they can speak out, and everyone will listen to what they have to say. But once I started thinking about it, I realized I'd never had that experience, never been made to feel of little account. I'd never been marginalized in any way. I'd been given every opportunity. I was born in 1964. So, what are the chances that a woman born in the year 2000, who's now 25, was ever oppressed or made to feel that she didn't have a voice or had no sanctioned role of significance in her society? It's just so clearly not true. And at the same time, I did recognize that men are constantly being made to feel that they're in the wrong and that they need to apologize for the way they were born. I think it's a terrible thing that we do. And I just, I hope more women will speak out, actually, and to accompany the men who are standing up for male value.
So I think we've almost reached towards the end of the discussion. I know that we have planned to discuss more things, but we'll probably take it in the part two of it. So before I
Maybe,
ask,
yeah.
yeah. So
Mhm.
before I ask the closing question, I want to state one point, very important one. So this was when I stumbled across one of your videos, which talked about how women's studies must be wiped out.
Mm.
So that was one of the favorite videos of mine that encouraged me to do the research, and I followed your um, approach step by step, and I think I've almost reached the same results as you have mentioned in your video. So I encourage the people, whoever is watching it, if you think that you're not convinced by what we have discussed so far, so the exercise for you is to revisit the syllabus that is being taught in the gender studies programs, and ask yourselves, by comparing with the data that is happening um, uh, in everyday life, and then compare it with what is being taught. So that's the exercise that I would suggest men and also women, if they're interested, to go through, so that I'm pretty much interested to know what their take is, because I don't want to tell them this is the answer and lead them to it. I'm very much interested, and I hope that many people do this exercise, because I'm telling you, this is pretty much scientific, the approach that you've suggested. So thank you for that, because it really gave a lot of insights for me, as an individual, not just depending on people who had come before me, talking about the anti-male propaganda that is being around us. So the last question that I have is: are there any projects that you are currently working on that will be released in the future, and would you like to tell us about it?
Well, I'm sort of stalled on a book that I've been writing on the history of feminist thought, which would essentially be an elaboration of the Fiamengo file video series, the 2.0, and some of the Substack essays that I've written as well. I would like to have something that would be easily accessible to a wide range of readers, that would just look at the primary texts. It wouldn't be a history of feminism, which would, need a huge volume, but just a history of feminist thought, looking at the words of feminists themselves, and so that people could judge for themselves whether feminism ever was a moderate, reasonable movement, whether it ever was without rancor towards men, whether it ever envisioned a positive relationship between men and women, whether it ever cared for men's troubles or the challenges that face boys, for example, in our societies. Um, and I think I've kind of paused it because I'm working very hard on my Substack essays. But that is a goal of mine to finish that book. So again, as you said, so that people can see, because a lot of people don't have time to go back and read Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman, from 1792, or even to read Simone de Beauvoir's 760-page tome, arguing that everything about how society enculturates women is to their detriment, or even Andrea Dworkin's crazy rantings about how men want a world in which women are terrified of rape because that allegedly benefits men. So I have tried to go through and look at all the major figures from the very beginning until pretty much the present, so that people can see the sort of outrageous lies that have passed as feminist knowledge. And that is my big concern about women's studies, is that it has lied to generations of young people, and continues to do so. It lies with statistics, it lies with numbers. Nearly every campaign that we see advertised in the media, I saw one just recently and wrote about it in my Substack, which was about how allegedly more women were suffering from traumatic brain injury or concussions as a result of domestic violence than hockey players. And they had taken a hockey idol in my hometown of Vancouver. He used to play, he was the captain of the Vancouver Canucks. They had him at the front and center of a campaign saying that the situation is so bad for women in Canada today that more women get concussions from being beaten by their partners than men playing hockey. And I looked into the research, and it's absolutely, it's so false, and it's so the way in which it plays with numbers to come to that outrageous conclusion is, it's so transparently mendacious that anybody could see the lies just by looking into it a little bit. And yet people don't. It's taken seriously, it's promoted, people hear about it and think, oh wow, if Trevor Linden and if the Young Women's Christian Association, the YWCA, and the Gender Studies program at the University of British Columbia, if they're all supporting this, it must be true. And it simply isn't true. The fact that we are making serious decisions in our culture based on lies, I just, and they're all anti-male calumnies to make men ashamed of themselves. Yeah, I just find that that's so upsetting and wrong. So yeah, so that's that. I guess that's my that's my project, but it's kind of stalled right now. I'm basically just living life, and I participate in a men's group organized by Paul Elam called XY Crew, where men gather to support each other. And I'm the one woman that gets to be involved in that, and that is the kind of group that I think more and more men need to be involved in, where they get to listen to other men affirming for them that their lives do matter, and that all the feminist nonsense is just that. It's just ideologically motivated drivel, and it's not connected to reality at all, and they shouldn't take it to heart.
Fantastic. So I think we've reached the end of the session. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this. This has always, been a pleasure for me to host you and discuss very important topics that still, uh, are necessary for the people to learn and then see a different view of the world. So that's about it. Thank you so much, Janice, for joining
Thank
me.
you very much. Really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.
Yep. So I'll end this right here.